So thank you for joining us for our webinar today on a happy invention of picture postcards. We're really pleased that you can be with us, and we're delighted to have Katherine Hamilton-Smith with us today. Katherine is the curator of the Postcard Archives. They originally were with the Lake County Forest Preserve, and now I believe they've been acquired by the Newberry Library. And I'm sure Katherine will tell us more about that. But additionally, she is the Director of Public Affairs and Development at the Lake County Forest Preserve. So Katherine, welcome.
Thank you.
So once Katherine's going to pull up her slides, and I'm going to turn off my microphone and my camera. I will be monitoring the chat, but I will see you back at the end of the presentation.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Roz, and thank you everybody for joining me today. Talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is picture postcards. I speak on this subject, as Roz briefly sketched, because I was the founding curator of a collection called the Curt Teich Postcard Archives, which was at the Lake County Forest Preserve, Lake County Discovery Museum, now called the Dunn Museum of Lake County, which is part of the Forest Preserve District. And Roz is also correct that just a few years ago, actually in 2017, the Forest Preserve District gave this collection to the Newberry Library, where it currently resides as one of their 11 core collections. And I'll talk a little bit more about that transition and about its being there at the Newberry Library during the course of my comments today. But that's why I know something about postcards, because I was hired many years ago to curate this collection and to provide public access to it. And in the process of doing that, I learned an awful lot about the history and significance of picture postcards, which is what I'm going to be sharing with you today. I do speak around the state of Illinois as part of the Illinois Humanities Rhodes Scholar Program. You see all the 2021-22 Rhodes Scholars on this. Actually, it's a promotional postcard about the program. And I am the person on the bottom row, right in the middle, the only black and white picture, I believe, in the entire, on the entire postcard. So that's me. All these folks, through the auspices of the Humanities Council, are available to public settings, such as libraries and historical societies and museums, to speak on some subject of special expertise that touches on the history of the state of Illinois, as does picture postcards. Maybe some of our attendees today know how that connection hooks up with Illinois, but I'll explain that too in just a few minutes. But I'm going to start, before I talk about the Newberry Library or the Curt Teich Company or the Curt Teich Postcard Archives, I'm going to start with a little information about the background of how picture postcards came to be. And I do so with this image you see on the screen here from the 1860s. This may look to your eye pretty much like a postcard, but maybe not quite. It's a little bit too skinny top to bottom, and it's a little bit too wide side to side. And you would be right if you identify that this is not a postcard, although it looks for all the world like it could be one. This is a piece of decorated, it's a piece of decorated stationery. And in fact, it's the envelope that would have been accompanied by letter writing paper of a similar decorative nature. Decorated writing paper and decorated envelopes associated usually with points of interest, travel points of interest, such as this example, which is our nation's Capitol building, came on the scene right before the Civil War, sort of the American Civil War, in that sort of middle 1800s time period. It is very similar in nature to picture postcards, in that purchasing this kind of stationery would usually be accompanied by somebody traveling someplace. They wouldn't have this kind of stationery at their home generally, but rather when they're on holiday, on vacation, or visiting some place of note. Letter writing was such a important way to communicate in those days, and doing so that all on a piece of stationery like this, where it also expressed something about an experience you were having, is one of the early examples of the use of color lithography to juxtapose with people's travels. As the middle class got larger, leisure time became a little bit more available to a broader swath of the public, people could travel more. And as they did that, they needed means to communicate. And this pictorial letterhead was one of those early means. I'm showing you one other example here. This is, you can even see the date of 1861. This is not an envelope. This is a piece of letter writing paper. And you can actually read what the person is saying here. She writes, "My dear George, I have been wanting to write to you for a long time, but have waited until I could get a sheet of paper with a pretty picture on it." So, and this actually looks like a postcard too, in a sense. It looks like an early sort of postcard, similar dimensions, top to bottom and side to side. One just quick aside about this particular image is you see right on the bottom, there's almost like a treasure map X, like cross marks the spot, and it says X in our house. And if you look up onto the bluff, right in the middle distance where the bluff is sort of illuminated by the sunlight, you see like a treasure map cross right there. And that just indicates where this person's vacation or holiday home or holiday home, I guess, was located. This example you can see is from Bournemouth, so it's an English example. We had an American example just a minute ago. So this is in sort of the early 1860s, maybe as far back as the 1850s. And it wasn't until 1869 in the German-speaking territories of Europe, specifically in Austria, that something came on the scene called correspondence card. And it was like a picture postcard that we think of today, although these were issued by the post offices themselves. And on the one side, it would have a place for the stamp and a place for the address. And on the other side, it would be blank. Sometimes these were used to advertise things. They could be overprinted with a picture of an advertised product, maybe medicinal syrup or a potbelly stove. All kinds of things were advertised on these cards. And in fact, this kind of official post office issued card is still published, is still printed today by the US Post Office. You can buy them with an affixed postage on one side, blank on the other for your communication. But these are thought of as the very first postcards as we know them, a stiffer piece of paper stock that was intended for a message, but didn't have a picture on it at this point. So we've got, we have this pictorial use of writing paper. And then we have this non-pictorial use of a stiffer card that did not have to be used in an envelope, could be used for correspondence or for advertising, that appeared in most of the German-speaking countries right around the end of the 1860s. And you can see from the correspondence card that it wasn't very soon after that postcard, spelled P-O-S-T-K-A-R-T-E, would have been a truncation of that correspondence card. And then of course, in all languages, they started to be called postcards. But it wasn't until 1889, so 20 years after most post offices around the world, certainly in the West, were issuing these postcards that were blank on one side, that the first picture postcards, as we think of them today, appeared. And they appeared in 1889 in Paris as part of the celebration of the Paris Exposition of 1889. And the great event of that Paris Exposition was the completion of the Eiffel Tower, which at the time, I mean, even today, if any one of us went to Paris, it's something that's not to be missed. You can still go up to the top of the Eiffel Tower, but in 1889, the Eiffel Tower was even more remarkable than it is today because it was the tallest human-made structure on the face of the earth. So if you ascended to the top of the Eiffel Tower, you were as high off the earth as you could get in those days that were pre-flight. So it was quite remarkable. And one of the things that occurred as part of this experience of going to the top of this extremely tall structure was that you could buy this newfangled idea, which was a picture postcard of the Eiffel Tower, and you could post it from the top of the Eiffel Tower, which you can actually still do today. These early issues were put out by the French newspaper Le Figaro, and they are regarded as the first picture postcards as we know them today. You can see from this example, though, on the right-hand side, this big blank space, and that's because if you think back to that correspondence card where I said that on one side of it, it was blank, and on the other side was the stamp box and the space for the address. For many years, from 1889 till into the teens in this country, the post offices would not handle your picture postcard if you wrote any kind of a message on the stamp side of the postcard. So the way these early postcards were designed was to accommodate for writing a message. And you can see the back of this one. In French, it's carte postale, which is the same thing as Postkarte in German. And you can even see that all they're accommodating for there is the address and the stamp. And if for those attendees who can read French, underneath the words carte postale, it says, ce côté est exclusivement réservé à l'adresse, which means this side is exclusively reserved for the address. This was very strictly adhered to in all countries. The post offices simply would not handle this newfangled idea and put it through the mail if there was anything on the stamp and address side but the stamp and the address. And so consequently, on the image side of the postcard, people really took advantage of that space. Hark back to the example with the Eiffel Tower on it. That was a little bit more framed up space, a smaller space. But some of these early postcards, such as this one, which is a Swiss example from a hotel, the Terminus Hotel in Bern, made not as much of the image portion of what they were trying to express there, but instead really set aside a good bit of real estate for somebody's message. There are even examples on these early postcards of what's today referred to as Victorian cross writing, where the correspondent would write, in one direction and then would actually turn the postcard 90 degrees and write directly across what they had just written. And these are actually pretty easy to read. If you receive one of them, your eye can focus and your brain can focus on reading the correspondence in one direction, then turning the postcard and reading it another direction. People really took advantage of the space that they had in these early postcards. So that brings us from Paris in 1889 to Chicago in 1893, because between 1889 and 1893, just those few years, in America, there still were no picture postcards like those that had been published for the exposition in Paris until the World's Columbian Exposition, when Charles W. Goldsmith, who was an entrepreneur, was given special dispensation by the United States Post Office to print this a series of 12 designs featuring the beautiful buildings of the World's Columbian Exposition. You see one of the 12 designs here. And you can see that they're kind of like those other early examples that I showed you, where there's a decorative element to it and then a space for the correspondence. And these are regarded as the first American picture postcards. And so Chicago in the state of Illinois is regarded as the birthplace of American picture postcards. So that brings us to this young man and a little bit of the story of the Curt Teich Company, and that's spelled T as in Tom, E-I-C-H, but pronounced Teich with a kind of a hard guttural German sound on the end of the word. Curt Teich is pictured here as a 19-year-old young man. He has just come to the United States from Germany. I'll show you where. He's from Lobenstein in Germany. This is just a modern map that shows the location of where he's from in modern day Germany. and a picture postcard of Lobenstein that was printed right about the time that he came to the United States. His father preceded him by a few years and came in 1893 for the World's Columbian Exposition, as people did. Hundreds of thousands of people from all over the world flocked to this city. And so many of them were influenced to settle here themselves and start businesses and start their families and their livelihoods, or to have their sons and daughters come to Chicago. And that was the case with the Teich family. Curt Teich's father returned to Germany, but he encouraged his son to seek his fortune in Chicago. And a few years after that, he did. He came in 1897 as he had just was about to turn 20 years old. His family and Lobenstein were from a printing heritage. And so printing in general was not something unusual to Curt Teich. And he founded a company in Chicago called the Curt Teich Company. This is the last of the 3 locations of the company. This particular building is still standing, and it is at Irving Park and Ravenswood. So this picture is taken as if you and I were standing in Irving Park Road, and the cross street there is Ravenswood. The building was pretty magnificent in its day, with its sort of turreted corner there. Curt Teich's office was in that second floor where you see the high domed window, those beautiful big picture windows looking out at that intersection of Irving Park and Ravenswood. He started in business printing anything that came through the door, just a jobber printer. This is a postcard advertising his company that he printed in about 1913. And you can see all the things that his company offers at that time: lithography of all stripes, printing, binding, photo engraving. But so postcards is just one of the things, including envelopes, letterheads. He printed a German language newspaper. He would print brochures. He pretty much would print almost anything that came through the door. But right about the time this postcard was printed, he began to really specialize in postcards. And he still, for the rest of the time the company was in business, which was 1898 to 1978, so almost 80 years of the 20th century, he still continued to print other things, but he is regarded eventually as the largest volume printer of view and advertising postcards in the world. And it all came out of the city of Chicago. I have a few examples of looking at the inside of the plant down there at Irving Park and Ravenswood. This is, you can even see in the inscription at the bottom there, the first offset press, 1910. The man that you see standing there is not Curt Teich. He is a pressman, which was then and now a very highly technical and highly professional job. And you can see that on the back of this press are stacked these huge blocks of paper. And that is how postcards were printed at that time, and also now, that they were printed many up across these large sheets of paper and then run through the press and then cut afterwards into the 3.5 by 5.5 familiar shape and size of the postcard. Eventually, in the heyday of the company, by the 1920s, certainly by the early 30s into the 40s, the company possessed 30 of these enormous Heidelberg presses. You can see this is a view down one of the press floors in that building I showed you. And if you look into the distance, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 presses, possibly an 8th press. All of them were 30 feet long and 10 feet wide, and as you can see, about 10 feet tall. Those gentlemen are maybe 6 feet. There's another 3 or 4 feet towering over them. And in the heyday, by the 20s and 30s and 40s, the company had the capacity to print 2.5 million postcards per hour out of this building in Chicago. Not that they did every minute of every day, but it gives you some idea of the volume of postcards on the market, and that produced by just this one company was certainly one of the most important and earliest companies, but not the only company that was producing postcards around the world. I think I just brought one other picture of the interior of the plant, and this is the art department. The Curt Teich company hired artists out of all of the design schools in Chicago in the teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, even into the 50s in the post-war years to do retouching of black and white photographs to make them into color postcards. You can see all those, besides the lights that are hanging down over these easels, you also see some additional hoses, and the hoses coming down over each desk is because each of these artist desks was equipped with an airbrush to assist in the process of retouching black and white photographs to make them into, to get them prepared to go on the press and become color photographs. And I'll show you an example of that process right at the end of my comments, the process of making a black and white photograph into a color postcard right at the end of my comments today. This is what the building looks like today. Same view as if we're standing in the middle of Irving Park Road looking back at the building. It is on the National Register of Historic Places, and it is condominiums, and it's called Postcard Place. They actually do have a small exhibition in the lobby of the building that talks about the history of the company. But you can see that it's not changed very much from when it was printing postcards. So Curt Teich's company, I mentioned a minute ago, printed view and advertising postcards. Later in the 20th century, they became best known for this type of postcard, which is referred to now as large letter postcard. But really their stock in trade from very early on, from about 1910 on, was this type of postcard. Views of towns and cities all across the United States. Not only was their capacity enormous out of the Curt Teich company, but they had a sales force that went all across the United States, all across Canada, and much of Central America, promoting the idea of picture postcards of places. And so consequently, they produced postcard views from beginning in about 1910 for all the states of the United States, some 10,000 towns and cities, tiny, tiny rural locations, as well as big cities, and all the provinces of Canada and many, many foreign countries. These sorts of postcards, I mean, the one you're looking at here, I chose, it's just a very typical view from this time period of Coopersville, Michigan, but it could be almost any location anywhere. That could easily be downtown Libertyville or downtown Highland Park at about the same time period. And that's something that's important about these early picture postcards, because the companies, and I'll talk a little bit later about individual photographers who went around the country taking what are called real photo postcards of all these burgeoning towns and cities, was one of the only ways that some of these spaces and places and locations and buildings were documented at all. This is a good example. It also comes from Illinois, from Pullman, Illinois. You can see that it's just the interior of the Pullman Trust and Savings Bank, taken about 1910. It was likely taken by the bank to promote its venue here, its location and services to the local community. But if you think about this for a minute, it's could, just like this Coopersville view, it could almost be any place. Again, it could be a bank in downtown Libertyville at the same time period. But because it was taken as a picture of this place, this unremarkable place, and documented or left to us from a documentary point of view, because it was published as a postcard, we know that what all of these very common, unremarkable places looked like. And if it were not for picture postcards, we probably would not have this documentary evidence of these places, because there's no real reason, if you think about it, for someone to have taken an interior picture of a place like a bank, unless they were going to use it to promote. And the way that it was promoted was on a picture postcard in these years. So it could be someplace that's been photographed a gazillion times, like the Flatiron Building in New York City, or the smallest rural, tiny, tiny locations, such as this one of Carmen, Illinois. At that time period, most people didn't own their own cameras. If they did, it was just a handful of people who did. And so picture postcards served this role unwittingly of documenting the United States as it grew and developed in the first decades of the 20th century. I'll show you two examples that kind of pull up that idea of how these common places are distinctive only because we know where they are, because they were printed as postcards. This one's in Sutersville, Pennsylvania, the railroad station there. And then this one, which is as you can see, marked in the Dunn Museum collection, is of the Sioux Line Depot in Prairie View, right very near the Vernon Area Library. Let me go back to that one in Pennsylvania. Look at the roof line, the way the decorative wooden features of attachment of the roof, those gables, very, very similar. We know, though, that they're two very distinct and pretty widely separated buildings because they were printed as postcards, labeled and printed as postcards. So now I'm going to just introduce you in a small section here of sort of the wonderful world of everything that's printed on postcards in the early 20th century to impress upon you how wide the swath of documentation really was in this format. And I'll start with this extremely charming card. It's one of my favorites that advertises the All States Auto Court in Portland, Oregon. It was published right about the time that auto tourism was beginning to be something fairly commonly done. As I mentioned just briefly a few minutes ago, people in the middle classes began to own cars. They began to have a little bit of leisure time, maybe a little bit of discretionary income that they could spend on travel. And auto tourism became a part and parcel of that burgeoning of the middle class. This particular image is, I think, terrific because the little tourist cabin is so homey in nature. It has a window box with flowers planted in it, and the cutaway that shows what you would experience if you stopped there for the night has a potbelly stove and a quilt on the bed, and it's extremely home-like. These early auto tourism courts were very much like that. They were sort of a home away from home, if you will. And even the coloration of this card is expressive of that, sort of modest colors, not pastel exactly, but muted, very typical of this time period. But then I'll couple that with this one from just about 18 years later. This is printed in 1939 of the Cool Motor gas station in Shreveport, Louisiana. Still a postcard about the open road and about America's love affair with the road, but very, very different in tone, in design. And it speaks to another way in which postcards are used today as documentary evidence, and that is how America, not just America, but how design features, architecture, fashion, I'll show a few examples here in a minute, the styling of cars, the styling of buildings changed over time, is all documented on this one 3.5 by 5.5 size. Everything that happened in communities was documented on postcards. This is Pumpkin Pie Day in Longmont, Colorado, which I recently found out is still celebrated in Longmont. Longmont is just pretty near Denver, and they still celebrate Pumpkin Pie Day. This is about a 1909 picture postcard that advertises that local community event. This one was published the year the Panama Canal was opened to ship transport, and iconographically marries the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean in this beautiful way, giving all the canal statistics there at the bottom. Sports were pictured on postcards. This is a group picture, as you see, of the 1906 Chicago Cubs. And just because I'm speaking to a Chicago audience, I also have the 1906 group team picture of the Chicago White Sox. It wasn't just organized sports, though, also pickup games and sort of backyard lot sporting events were also pictured on postcards. Now, this is, I believe, the first postcard I've shown you that so far that was not published by the Curt Teich Company. And at this point, I should say that I'm going to begin to talk a little bit more widely about postcards in general, and also a little bit about real photo postcards. And this is a good example of it. This is actually a local example. You can see in the handwriting, it's from Highland Park, Illinois. And it's somebody with a camera took a photograph of a pickup football game in Highland Park and wrote to somebody else, "We all miss you. Come back for the game on Saturday. Boo rah rah, Highland Park, Illinois," and even identify some of the guys that are getting ready to hike the ball there. You can see right up in the upper left-hand corner, it says city, C-I-T-Y. That probably is an indication. It looks like an E, but it's a C. And it's probably an indication this was sent within the town of Highland Park. I'll talk a little bit about real photo postcards here a little bit more in a minute. But just still in this idea of how everything was captured on picture postcards is a short series I have for you that shows something different from sports and fashion and auto tourism. It's not just those things that were documented on postcards, but also cultural changes and cultural experiences. I have, I think, 4 examples here today that show a little bit about how the African-American experience was documented on picture postcards. This is an interesting example. I didn't know anything about it when I first encountered it. I didn't know what "Tell 'em we're risin'" meant, but I'll tell you the story very quickly. So "Tell 'em we're risin" became a motto for the post-Civil War effort of African Americans to rise out of slavery and become part of a different part of American culture. So there's this young man, his name is Richard Robert Wright. He was born in 1855, so just 5 years before the beginning of the American Civil War, down in Georgia. And he, at the conclusion of the Civil War, he was only a 10-year-old boy in Atlanta when a Union general, General O.O. Howard, came down from the north to the south on a campaign of trying to heal the country, and was at a certain point addressing a crowd in the city of Atlanta. And at the end of his remarks, he called out to the assembled crowd, "What message should I tell them, should I take back to the North? Tell me what I should take back to the North." And this little 10-year-old boy, Richard Robert Wright, had the guts to call out, "Tell them we're risin'." And somehow the newspapers caught hold of that motto. It got printed the following day. And Richard Robert Wright grew up to be a leader in the African-American community in the post-Civil War period. And this became a rallying cry for an entire generation of African Americans. And here, that whole story is told on a picture postcard. In the same small grouping of postcards associated with the African American experience is this one. You can see along the bottom, it says it's the colored men's dressing room at the National Malleable Castings Company in Indianapolis. It comes from a series of 10 postcards. I show you a few more here. The upper left-hand corner says it's the white men's dressing room, and I'll switch back to the colored men's dressing room. You can see that there's no difference in the facilities. They are just simply segregated. And on the upper right-hand side, the color employees' lunchroom, and the lower middle there, the employees' dining room. So this series has no other explanation except that it shows that at this particular company in about 1910, their facilities were segregated. So again, on postcards, we have documentary evidence that might not otherwise be captured. We're not sure why the National Valuable Castings Company wanted to print this series, but they were clearly proud of their facilities. I don't think that at that time they were thinking much about the segregated aspect to it, except that they wanted to show their facilities. And picture postcards was the way to do that. It was really almost the only way to do that. And then finally, this in this series was printed about 13 years later. You can even see the copyright date up in the upper left-hand corner, 1923. And this was printed by the Curt Teich Company, as were all these other cards for the KKK. And it's an interesting example of something that's important about the Curt Teich Company's company archives that came down to us and still remains to us today. And that is that Teich would accept and print whatever came through the door. He had a national, indeed international service sector, so to speak. He printed cards for the entire of North America, and he would print whatever came through the door. And I call this an uncurated archives, if you will, because there was nobody saying, well, we'll print this, but we won't print this, we'll print this, but we won't print this. Rather, he viewed all of these as jobs. And so in a manner, you could say that what remains to us today is America, or North America, but America as it saw itself on the face of picture postcards. And that's why we have all the good things and all of the things that are challenging and troubling. So back into this dip into the wonderful world of what's printed on postcards, fashion, wonderful examples of fashion from Art Nouveau fashion, such as you see here, to a little bit later in the century. On the left-hand side is the interior of a club car from a train. And actually, both of these are train cars. So the one on the right-hand side is the dining car, and the one on the left is the club car. But you can see that on picture postcards is expressed all the changes in fashion, how interiors were designed, all the accoutrements of the table, everything that had to do with what our lives looked like at that time period was captured on postcards. A little bit later in the century, this really terrific 1950s image from a casino in Las Vegas. In a similar time frame, this is actually a public pool in Hinsdale, Illinois. These women, bathing beauties in the foreground here in their 1950s bathing suits. And this postcard, also printed by the Curt Teich Company, is actually an advertising card for the company that makes this furniture. But so on the face of it, they're just showcasing the furniture with what they regard as the ideal family. But we see it today as kind of mid-century modern, if you will, furniture, and kind of a glimpse into what is an accepted standard for domestic interiors at that time. And then even a little bit later in the early 1960s, the color changes, the presentation changes, even the jewelry changes. Lockets like this were very popular in the 1960s, and the hairstyle, the sort of choker that the girl is wearing in the top and the middle picture, all of it is expressive of how fashion and style changes. But it wasn't just style, fashion, those sorts of things that were captured. It was also events. And so I'm going to dip a little bit into the real photo postcards and how they were used to capture events. So if you owned a camera in these early decades of the 20th century, Kodak and Azo and a couple of other companies did have on the market photosensitized paper that was 3.5 by 5.5 inches in size. So the size of a postcard, pre-printed with a stamp box and a place for your message and a place for your address on one side. And then on the blank side, it was sensitized for you, whether you were a professional itinerant photographer or whether you were just a person who was lucky enough to own a camera, could use it to record whatever it is you took a picture of. And these real photo postcards remain to us today some of the only visual documentary evidence of events that happened in communities. This is the collapse of a bridge in rural Pennsylvania. This is a tornado in Omaha, Nebraska in Easter 1913. Two postcards from a series showing also the wreckage of a tornado in Murfreesboro, Illinois. You can see the upper example is the remains of the high school, and the lower example is the remains of the Baptist church. This one is not a disaster exactly, but pardon me, certainly an event. This is the destruction of liquor during Prohibition in front of the Montgomery County Courthouse in Independence, Kansas, recorded on a picture postcard. It wasn't just tragedies and sort of shocking events, but all the wonderful things that happen in communities were also pictures of them were taken by photographers, either professional or amateur, and then printed on picture postcards. Parades are among the most commonly printed in these wonderful, charming, early real photo picture postcards. But everything else you can imagine. This is a road building crew in Georgia. This is an advertising card for a tailor in in Missouri, rural Missouri. Now, we don't know anything about this man except that this is one of the ways that these photo postcards were used, was to promote these tiny, tiny businesses who didn't otherwise have any kind of an advertising budget. This man, I think, probably works as a tailor out of his lodging. I think this is his lodging. I think where you see the clothes hanging above on the left there, it's above his bed that's been covered over. And he's just had somebody take a picture of all the wares and all of the abilities he has as a tailor, and probably distributed copies of this postcard in the town to use his skills. Views of famous scenes such as San Francisco's Chinatown on a real photo postcard. And in this one, I encourage you to really look at all of the detail that you see in these real photo postcards. If this were a printed postcard, such as the Teich company would print, it would be colored, and they would probably be removing lots of things that might be in the way, like, curb markings, garbage if it was on the street, garbage cans. They might put clouds in the sky. They might change the image to sort of be more promotional. But the real photo postcards, they did not do this. And so consequently, they give us really wonderful detail of some of these locations. Skipped over two there, I realize I'll come back to them. But people were also pictured on these real photo postcards, and it could be the craziest sort of either most average people, like just you and I go out and someone has a little brownie camera and they take a photograph and we decide to send a few postcards of it to our family, or it could be a remarkable character such as this rattlesnake rustler somewhere in the American Southwest. This is on a real photo postcard, an itinerant preacher who was going around spreading the gospel in his sort of gypsy-like van. And these two are a little bit closer to home. And the man on the right-hand side is my great-grandfather, who this picture postcard came down to me because he sent it to my grandmother. And on the back of it, he did write exactly what had happened. He said that a photographer came to town and was there for a week, and he decided to go and have his portrait taken, and he purchased 10 of these postcards. And then he proceeded to tell my grandmother to whom he had sent the postcards. But that was a very typical thing. There are people, men, almost entirely men, did make their living being itinerant photographers who would go to different, especially rural locations, set up shop for a period of time with all these sort of props, like you see this chair that my great grandfather has his hand on, and invite people for a very, very reasonable amount to come in and have their portrait taken. And in many cases, this is the only way that people of average means could have a formal portrait taken, and they were published in postcards. And I encourage all of you to look at your own family photographic collection, because from this time period, if you have anything around 1910, between 1910 and the First World War, roughly, look at the back of it, and it might well be imprinted on one side as a postcard, even if the people didn't use them as postcards. And then on the left-hand side is my father, also on a picture postcard. And here he is on the top of Rockefeller Center in New York City, looking down Manhattan Island toward the Empire State Building. And this was taken right before he shipped out to the Pacific during World War II, where he served as an Army chaplain. So these are two picture postcards separated by 2 generations. So it's his grandfather, my father, and then me talking to you today. But I encourage you all to look at your own family photographs. You may well find picture postcards among them. But it wasn't just average people like this rattlesnake rustler and the itinerant preacher and my great grandfather and my father, but very, very famous people. Most famous people ended up on picture postcards as well. This one is an interesting example from 1921 of Benito Mussolini. It looks like that's written in a foreign language, but it's not. It is in English. So I will read it in transcriptions and you can follow along. It says, quote, "This is a recent photograph of Mussolini, a strong face, but not the brutal one some caricatures make of it. Mussolini's mother taught him to read when he was 6. When he was 9, she insisted, notwithstanding his father's indifference, that he should be put into a boys' school. He had a few terms in a normal school at Bologna and a few in the university at Lausanne. He is a great student of history, political economy, and languages. Of these last, he speaks 4, and at 38, he is leading Europe, some say the world." So it's just kind of brings you full circle to all of the characters and people and experiences that appear documented on picture postcards. And so I take you back to Paris with this charming picture. I'm just transporting you with this charming picture postcard of a puppet show in the gardens along the Champs-Élysées in 1910. To bring you back to thinking about the Eiffel Tower in 1889 and the beginning of postcards. This is the back, shows the back of a 1907 postcard. You can see the 1907 postmark up in the upper right-hand corner. And she says, "Dearest Pearl, yesterday it was a very clear day in Paris. We had quite a good time in the afternoon and went to the very top of La Tour Eiffel." And I show you this because think about those 1889 very first picture postcards ever sent from the top of the Eiffel Tower. This one from 1907, so a couple of decades later. And then this one sent about another almost 100 years later in 1999. And says the same thing. "I'm writing to you from the clouds. We are at the top of the Eiffel Tower looking out at beautiful Paris," as she spreads before us. And my point in showing this is to impress upon you, not only I've been showing you all the sorts of things that are documented by postcards and why it was such an important documentary, it served such an important documentary function in those early decades of the century. But I think it's also gives us pause to think that people still, from the very beginning, send postcards in exactly the same way as they did from the very first ones in 1889 to today. And just a few weeks ago, actually, I got a postcard from my son and his wife who were traveling to Mount Rushmore. And he just sent a postcard. I actually have it here and it says, "Hi, Mom, greetings from Wall, South Dakota. We're on our way to Mount Rushmore." And it's just a picture of his trip to Mount Rushmore, but it got me thinking, you know, he didn't send that to me because postcards are have been my profession for so long, but rather because even a 26-year-old young man still has the inclination to do the exact same thing, to match experience with a picture, with a correspondence, sending it through the mail to someone they care about. And postcards have just not changed at all since they came from their beginnings to today. And so just the end of the whirlwind tour of what's on postcards, I'll show you a few more. It's a wonderful image from 1964. This is also printed by the Curt Teich Company for the Beatles in 1964 when they appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. And then 30 years later, not printed by the Teich Company because printed in 1994, but nonetheless, this is a picture, this is an advertising postcard for the Rolling Stones album Voodoo Lounge. And these two, separated by 30 years of time, different bands, but exactly the same reasons. It's a promotional use of postcards. Politics, are pictured on postcards. This is an English example, encouraging people to vote conservative. This is a picture postcard with the Eisenhower family, with Mamie and the children. A picture of Richard and Pat Nixon and their daughters, all on a picture postcard. On the other side of the aisle and back to Illinois is a son of Illinois, Adlai Stevenson, on a picture postcard. And then one more in this sort of grouping of political cards is one of my favorite political picture postcards, also an English example, also a conservative example, actually, calling attention to Prime Minister Tony Blair, who served as Prime Minister from 97 to 2007. And the reason I call it one of my favorites is because you just cannot miss graphically what's going on here. It's definitely a polemic idea of the Conservative Party and the Labor Party. And so I'll talk a little bit about collecting postcards. I don't know if any of our participants today collect postcards, either casually or very systematically, but back in what was referred to as the golden age of postcards from about 1889, that Paris Exposition, to the First World War, everybody had postcards in their lives. Almost everybody, certainly in the West, had postcards in their lives. They saved them in albums such as this one, pulled them out when visitors might come in the evening just to look at where they had been, or maybe an aunt or a family member had sent postcards and you were accumulating them in an album. It was a parlor pastime to look at postcards. There were postcard exchanges around the country. And this is actually a picture postcard of a postcard exchange in Alabama. And you can see that it's quite a social place with refreshments served at and kind of like a soda fountain setting on the right-hand side there, and postcards everywhere. You would buy them, you would write them to pen pals, you would exchange them in lots of different ways. But it was just a rage at that time. This is not a postcard exchange, but it is a picture, a real photo picture postcard of the interior of a stationery store in Tennessee. And you can see that postcards figure prominently. Those couple of racks on right in the middle distance there on the left-hand side are postcard racks. So one of them is shaped like the Ferris wheel, and it actually does turn around so that you can rotate it and look to see what postcard you want to purchase and pick up. So everyone back in the day had postcards in their lives. And that's why maybe some of our participants this afternoon might have had groups of postcards come down from a favorite aunt or grandmother or someone who's gone by, because people not only collected them, but they kept them. There's something sort of precious about postcards that makes you not want to get rid of them. But today, postcard collecting is, people do it in a very serious way. And the man I'm showing you here is probably regarded as one of the world's most serious, if you will, postcard collectors. You're looking at a picture of Leonard Lauder. His mother was Estee Lauder, who founded the famous Estee Lauder Cosmetic Company, of which he is now chairman emeritus. So he is a very, very wealthy man today. He's on the Forbes list of billionaires, actually. But the reason I show him is because he is not only a famous art collector, because he has such great worth. You see behind him Picasso, one of about 20 some paintings, Cubist paintings that he gave to the Metropolitan Museum of Art a few years ago. But he started collecting by collecting postcards when he was a little boy. His family would go down to Miami in the wintertime when he was a little boy, and he was so captivated by the architecture and by the, in a tourist area like Miami, there are postcards just literally everywhere. Every corner drugstore and vendor would have postcards, and he began to collect postcards. It was his earliest, not only entree to postcards, but also to the visual and to being captivated by visual things. Today, and you recognize this woman on the right-hand side, I showed her a little bit earlier when I was talking about fashion, but Mr. Lauder collects amazing types of postcards, mostly having to do with art. So he collects, what you're looking at here is actually two from the Wiener Werkstatt, which was an artists' collective in Vienna from 1903 to about World War I. This artist collective, they made lots of different things, decorative arts, some furniture, but among the things that they produced were 925 postcards, of which you see 2 here. He collects those. You can see that isn't far off from his interest in fine art. Pardon me. And he collects Japanese postcards. You see 2 here. One is on the left-hand side, it's just a beautiful woodcut of a rural scene in Japan. And on the right-hand side, this is from the Tournament of the Far Eastern Athletes, which was a 1912 tournament. Both of them, you can see, though, have a sensibility about them that touches on fine art. This is also in his Japanese collection. This is a view of the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo that was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. But he also collects just sort of general history images, not necessarily touching on fine art, including images related to the women's right to vote movement and the suffragettes. He collects Santas, which is kind of interesting in that his family is Jewish, and he so it's just interesting that he collects Santas. This is from his collection and is unusual because Santa is wearing a purple coat, which makes it more collectible. And he also collects 1933-34 Chicago World's Fair postcards, of which you see an example here. This one touches a little bit more on the fine art. You can see touches of why he would be interested in this visually. The reason I'm talking about Mr. Lauder is because at a certain point when we were working with the Curt Teich Postcard Archives, before we gave it to the Newberry Library, we began to broaden the collecting scope of the archives to include postcards produced by any entity anywhere in the world or anything having to do with postcards. So we really broadened the collecting scope, and at that point began to accept collections from collectors of postcards. And Mr. Lauder gave part of his collection to the Curt Teich Postcard Archives before it went into the Newberry collection. And there are also a few examples of other wonderful collections within the Curt Teich Archives. One of them is of amusement parks, such as Disneyland there on the right, and White City, the beautiful White City amusement park that was in Chicago after the World's Columbian Exposition. And then there's also an amazing collection of Route 66 postcards within the Curt Teich Archives. This was the pretty astounding work of a single postcard collector who set out to try and collect every postcard printed or having to do with Route 66 from Chicago to Santa Monica Pier in Los Angeles. whether or not he was successful, he collected hundreds of thousands of examples of Route 66 postcards. I'll just show you a quick couple here. Great real photo postcard of Winslow, Arizona. This is one of my favorites. I think it's just touches my baby boomer heart. Something about the neon and the cars there in the parking lot remind me of when I was a very little girl and we go on road trips with my family. And this one is from Holbrook, Arizona. It's one of my favorites from the Route 66 collection, because there's Route 66 right in front of you, just asphalt in the desert. And then right on the roadside, you have this great multifaceted location you can stop where there's a coffee shop, a refined cocktail bar. I don't know quite what that means, but it's just so intriguing. An organist, Fred Laskowski, who'll play pieces at your request. There's arts and crafts. You can gas up, and it's all right here on Route 66. But there's something about the starkness of this image with the asphalt of Route 66 on the desert itself, and then that cloudless sky and sort of featureless landscape that's quite charming about this particular example. And so in case you're worrying, I know I'm right at my hour, and I just have a few more images to show you, including some from Vernon Township location. But I wanted to show you first this example of creating a color postcard in the Teich Company from a black and white photograph. So what you're looking at is a color postcard of Kirk's Better Foods in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, 1951. This is the finished postcard. And this is the black and white photograph that would have been sent from Kirk's Better Foods in Sioux Falls to the plant in Chicago to turn it into a postcard. And so if you look at this, you'll notice a lot about it, actually. You'll notice there's a bus tray in the middle foreground there. There's some sort of a cloth has fallen behind the counter. There's people, there's a group of people either exiting or entering the door. And you'll notice also that big wall there on the right-hand side is empty. I'll go back to the finished postcard because you can see that it's quite changed from the reality. And so this black and white photograph is sent to, is sent to the plant in Chicago with instructions as to what to do to it to make the postcard that they envision. And so the instructions are written on the back of the postcard, and I mean on the back of the photograph, including that the ceiling should be dark green, that the walls should be light green, the seats are buff. And look at the last instruction. It says, remove farmer at door, which I think is such an interesting and kind of odd thing to say, because in Sioux Falls, South Dakota in 1951, I think most of their clientele would come from the surrounding farms, but they want to remove the farmer at the door. Here is the retouched version that they're getting set to put on the press. And then of course you saw that finished version, and look at the wallpaper too. So we can only guess that maybe they were redoing Kirk's and putting up new wallpaper, and that's why they wanted to print a new postcard. And so because all they could send was the black and white photograph to Chicago, they also, in some of these instances, would send a picture, an actual piece of whatever was important for the color. And in this case, that is a piece of the wallpaper that still exists in the files for the Teich Company, so that the printer could get the color right. And so that shows you one example of the process of turning the black and white photograph into a color postcard. All the color was added on the press. And what I've shown you is one example of 126,000 of these art files that were in the Curt Teich Company when it was given over into public hands to be made accessible to the public. So that's just one example. So right at the end here, I'm going to take you to kind of our local area. So I'm bringing you back to Chicago with this great image of the Chicago Board of Trade in the 1950s. But now we're going to go right to the area kind of in the Vernon Township sort of service sector for the library. I just picked a number of kind of local images, including a few from Deerfield. This wonderful Curt Teich large letter postcard from Highland Park. A great view of Deerfield Road in Highland Park. For all of those of us who live in this area, this is, it's so unremarkable. There's nobody on it. There's nothing to be seen really, but because we know our area today, and this isn't that long ago, it just gives you pause to understand how our area and our world and our nation has changed. And in this example of my comments today, what a wonderful place picture postcards have in documenting those changes. This is the Union Church in Half Day. A couple of wonderful views of Half Day. This is the general store in Half Day. There has been a general store in the Half Day area since 1843. That is 20 years before the Civil War, before the end of the Civil War. So that, Half Day and that area is really the earliest non-native settled area in Lake County. It's another view of a different store, the Solomon Brothers store in Half Day. Half Day was also a stagecoach stop. And I think I have this picture of the Half Day Inn. I think the Half Day Inn, there's been an inn in Half Day since 1843 or 1844. And those of us who've lived in this area for a long time knew that this stood there for quite a long time. It was only torn down not too long ago. But it was a stagecoach stop. And so a lot of the early postcards I found to share with you today are those of these intersection and the businesses that were built along the intersection and supplied the stagecoach stop. This is Vernon Cemetery in Half Day, where some of the earliest grave markers in the Lake County are located, including, I think, that of Laura Sprague, who was the first documented teacher in Lake County. I believe she is buried in this cemetery. The racetrack in Libertyville, Illinois, because Libertyville used to be the county location of the county fair, and it had a racetrack. A couple other views of Libertyville. This really does not look very different. Take out the cars and, in modern cars and streetlights, and it would be pretty much the same. That's Cook Park on the left-hand side there. One more view of Milwaukee Avenue in Libertyville. Oh, and one more Libertyville kind of area card is this one. It's from a small series of cards printed in the 60s for Lamb's Farm. The Deerfield Post Office. Beautiful little structure, actually, I think. And the Village Hall. And I think this is the last picture I brought from Lake County. I realize it's not in the Vernon Township area, but it speaks to me to Lake County. This is up in Fox Lake, and just something about it. When you look at this, you can just feel the summertime and the chain of lakes, which was such a draw for people from Chicago. So it's just kind of a quintessential Lake County image. And so the wonderful world of postcards is everything from absolute things that were just published as charming images to those like these two, to those that I've shown you of local views. And I leave you with these last two. This one was sent in 1907 by Pablo Picasso to his friend Guillaume Apollinaire. And I just think it's a wonderful example of how my son sent a postcard from South Dakota, and everyone sends postcards, including the most famous among us. And all of this is now at the Newberry Library. So if you haven't visited, I encourage you to do that. The library is a private library, but it is free and open to the public, and they have wonderful exhibitions, and you can search the Curt Teich Postcard Archives through their website. And I know I'm 9 minutes over time, so I apologize for that. And I'm very happy. I will stop my screen share now, and I'm very happy to answer any questions that people might have.
And can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm having some trouble with my Zoom. So I'm glad as you can hear me. There was a question in the Q&A. Someone would like for you to talk a little bit about those local photographers, the ones who were kind of taking photos of individuals in these small towns. Was it organized? Were they just individuals? Was there a company that kind of organized these photographers?
The ones that were what I refer to as itinerant photographers. And a good example is whoever it was who took the picture of my great grandfather, what he luckily actually described on the back of this in real time, said that a photographer came to town. He used those exact words, a photographer came to town. And so there were men, mostly men, of which I'm aware anyway, who made their livelihood go as photographers who go around rural United States and spend a little bit of time in a town and take pictures and set up and take portraits, but also would take pictures of whatever was going on, like parades, and then make those available to people. So that was not organized. Now, there were real photo companies, and there are some extremely robust companies that existed around the Chicago area that did only real photo postcards, did not do the printed postcards. There's one called C.R. Childs, Childs. If you have real photo postcards of any Lake County location or Chicago location, you might look to see if they're C.R. Childs. They're all marked on the face of it. There's another one called ML that did a lot of real photo kind of pictures of the towns up in the chain of lakes. And there were others. Those are more studios. So they were organized in the sense that they didn't wander around. They would work out of a studio in a location and then kind of had they might go away for a day or two, but it's not quite the same as whoever the guy was who came to town and shot the photograph of my great grandfather. So some organized and some not really organized.
Is there a postcard that's been like elusive to you, like one you really want to add to your collection, but you just haven't been able to get your hands on?
Is that your question or someone had
Yes,
that?
that's my question.
This is your question. Nothing's just come out clearly.
Okay.
Nothing's just coming to mind.
Okay.
If it does, yeah, there's not something like the holy grail of postcards out
Okay.
there. In terms of value of postcards, yeah, there are postcards that are known to be of specific value. And among them are some of the work. Do you remember that really beautiful one of the Art Nouveau lady with the very sinuous organic drapery? That is the work of the Czechoslovakian artist Alphonse Mucha. And some of Mucha's cards are among the most valuable postcards. But when we were working on the Curt Teich archives, we didn't think about the monetary value of things. We thought about how their documentary value. So there is the Holy Grail out there. I think that Picasso card is pretty nice. That's not in the Teich collection. I just happen to know that exists.
Okay. Well, good. Well, I just want to thank you so much for this presentation. It was really just fascinating to hear about this whole world of something that we probably just take for granted, just that there's the thoughtfulness behind the presentation, the way it was organized, and just, yeah, there's I think a lot of people just take postcards for granted and didn't really necessarily look at them as an art form and a way to really document our history. So it was really fascinating. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And again, I just encourage all the participants to, if they're interested at all, the postcards are now among the 11 core collections of the Newberry Library. And I just want to say that some of the others are American history and culture, history of the book, medieval Renaissance and early modern studies, and postcards.
It's really impressive. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So go on their website. You can go to, I think it's research and collections, and then just click on postcards and it gives you, it's very easy to navigate. I highly recommend that you just take a little time and poke around. And if you're ever in Chicago, go to the Newberry. They always have wonderful exhibitions. They're always free and a great gift shop.
That sounds wonderful. Well, Catherine, thank you for joining us, and thank you to everyone for joining us at home this afternoon. We hope you enjoyed today's program, and you'll get a recording from me tomorrow so you can share it with others.
And if anyone thinks of questions afterwards, they can give them to you, Roz, and you can get them to me. So
absolutely.
okay,
Happy to.
bye
All right.
everybody. Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.